All right. I don't know, a little loud. I hope everybody's awake. Good afternoon. My name is Gene Jones. I'm executive director for a nonprofit called CanEd, Cannabis Education. And welcome to the 6th annual Florida Medical Cannabis Conference. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I'm going to save my introduction comments till tomorrow morning, an essence of time, so that we can get going with this first workshop. This particular workshop is going to go over the University of Florida's research panel discussion related to cannabis from marijuana to hemp. So you're going to hear each individual segments related to what's going on at the university and research related to hemp and cannabis. This particular session is going to be moderated by Dr. Jeffrey Block, who I've had the opportunity to work with on this program. All the docs in the room and that will be attending the event can thank Dr. Block because without him, we wouldn't have CME accreditation for this. So I greatly appreciate his efforts and what he did. I did not know the level of effort it is that takes place with going through ACCME accreditation. This year is completely different than what we've had to do in the past with credentials for CME accreditation. So again, Dr. Block, thank you, sir. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you and just let you run with the program because I know we've got a lot to cover in a short period of time. And so with that, Dr. Block, all yours, sir.
Thanks, Gene. Get the first slide back up. All right, thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm sitting next to 3 distinguished doctorates, and you'll be meeting them one by one after I go over a few basic slides. This is who they are, and I will tell you that the reason I'm privileged to speak, although I'm from the University of Miami, with my colleagues at the University of Florida, is that when Florida as a state had its very first law on cannabis almost a decade ago, it specifically distinguished the University of Florida and Florida A&M because those were the only 2 Florida schools that had both a school of agriculture and a school of pharmacy. I'm from the University of Miami School of Medicine. Dr. Cook on the end of the panel here is from the University of Florida as an MD. But I wanted to point that out because there is a certain benefit of speaking with academicians at times. Not that the conversation has to be all academic, but this gives me a great platform to share with you the real supporting science. So moving along. Slides are not progressing, gentlemen. Thank you. So, this meeting, one of the things I spoke with Gene Jones about before offering to do this, I really did want to have this whole weekend focus on those issues that affect Florida and public health. So I think this is a wonderful slide because it brings into account those particular items. There's 9 things listed here, from tobacco smoking all the way to the left, all the way to the right on drug abuse. But this is data from about 15 or 20 years ago. So what's happened is that tobacco smoking over these last 20 years has gone down. That is a public health victory. But drug abuse at the end, in particular lethal opioid overdoses, has gone up. So much so that if we look at trends over those 15 years, leading up to about 5 years ago, 2019, go back. Things are progressing without me touching the slides here, unfortunately. Thank you. So the importance in this trends, and this is not just a moment in time right now. The trends then, as we progress from tobacco smoking going down, as I was just showing you, and drug abuse going up, has changed dramatically in these past years. This is the concern about public health because those rates have gone way up, actually surpassing, as you see, their motor vehicle accidents, and probably now with fentanyl having been the scourge over the last several years, well higher than that. So the trends are what are followed by public health officials. And as I mentioned, my colleague, who's the MD at the end of the row here, is not only an MD, he also has his master's in public health. So the selection of who's in front of you today is going to pay attention to that here. I wanted also to bring up the differences between some other drugs and cannabis in terms of what parts of the brain lead to things like fentanyl's fatal outcomes. And that's because of where there are receptors in the brainstem affecting respiration. Cannabinoids are not present in the brainstem. And if you see from this slide where those X's are, that makes a big difference in the statistics for lethal consequences. Sometimes the consequences, though, are not necessarily lethal, that lead to still to public health concerns. So then moving right along, these are relative risks. And you can see at the bottom, it looks wonderful how safe cannabis seems to be compared to, say, alcohol, which is a pure toxin, heroin, and those things mentioned after. But don't be misled by this. We're talking about lethal outcomes. So moving then right along, driving. And we don't have anybody speaking this weekend specifically about impaired driving, but that too is a public health concern. These are the driving simulators at the University of Iowa, which the NTSB uses the same way that we have. Same thing for airline pilots. And there are certain things in data that come out about driving when intoxicated with alcohol, cannabis, or either that are germane to this, all public health concerns. We also have here Dr. Brym, who's going to be speaking more about cannabis as hemp, which is most of the 6,000-year history of how cannabis found its way around the world with human agriculture. That's a key point. From certain areas in Asia there, you see up in the top right, this is where it began shortly after the last ice age, where certain species of plants and humans survived when others in other places in the world didn't, found its way around the world to where we are today. And even to colonial America, where George Washington had on his plantations hemp farms, and also knew not simply about the textile portions of hemp, but also about the drug forms and letters that he wrote that are historically documented. So here in the United States, then, we've been farming hemp for centuries, but in particular, these are photographs which resonate differently. And even though they're black and white, it's not ancient history at all. It was an agricultural crop before 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act and everything that included hemp with it. Then with respect to it as a medicine, I wanted to point out hemp in the label of that older pharmaceutical extract because it was Indian hemp. The particular varietals coming from India, otherwise people think of as indica, featured THC, which was the intoxicating substance there. And the word marijuana came to be in 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act, spelled differently today, but that's what brought that word into the vernacular, distinguishing it from hemp even today. Continuing on then, I wanted to let you know that I'm sitting next to a pharmacist. And as he would know from Pericles on the left, this is a comment on potency. Sometimes the dose defines what's a poison. And this is classic teaching of toxicology. That's why I'm delighted that we have a representative from the School of Pharmacy. Continuing on then, these are dose response curves to pain. Ideally on the left there, you give a dose and you don't get the consequences of, say, opioids, which take more and more to get the same analgesic effect. On the right, you'll see what's called an inverted U. This is a response curve such as one gets from cannabis, where at lower doses for pain, it's known to be quite effective. When you exceed the lower doses, not only sometimes is the analgesic potential lost, but sometimes the pain is perceived as even worse. Many people who take cannabis for pain get past that sweet spot and expecting, like other drugs, such as opioids, I may need more now to help my pain. They're mistaken that way. And this is what the data supports for dosing. So then to wrap it up there, this is why you may have heard the phrase of start low and go slow. And I'd like you to read with me a moment what the goal is of an optimal dose. And that's to ensure that both cannabis naive and cannabis tolerant patients can achieve safe and effective outcomes where the clinical benefits exceed the risks. And then the optimal outcome goal, which is somewhat different than the dose goal, is to ensure that cannabis's impact on the endogenous system remains consistent with endocannabinoid system's therapeutic purpose. So my bias in teaching has always been that you need to have a good understanding of the purpose and how the body's own system works if you're going to be able to interpret what is still relatively little evidence-based data for the plant itself. So the plant is working in the endogenous system. We don't have the system because there's a plant out there with THC, quite the opposite. The plant has been around for a mere blip in history of about 60 million years, while endocannabinoid systems, not only in humans, but in all vertebrates and some invertebrates, we know of this, dates back 500 million years. It's how we're hardwired. I want to point out one thing about kids and when they get cannabis labeling and what happens with black and gray market influences. As you see here, this is what's appealing to kids, not necessarily something, that looks like a gummy, but watch what happens to the screen here to things that have been found that have been distributed out there. Looks pretty familiar there, but when you look at things closely, it's rather deceptive. And to a kid who may not even read yet and just knows a piece of candy, this is dangerous stuff. So moving on then to the politics, 1970 changed everything with the Controlled Substances Act. This is its signing, where the DEA then became the regulatory body. I'm licensed two ways, once federally and once by my state. The federal license is a DEA privilege to basically prescribe medications, while my state license to practice is unique to Florida. Those need to be distinguished, and many physicians are not going to want to get involved where they feel that one license might be threatened for the other. And this puts physicians in a real bind because their licenses are in conflict with what is legal, with one license may not be legal in the practice of medicine where they're choosing to practice. So my only advice to those who are practicing medicine is know where you're going with the cannabis you have, so you don't become like a women's basketball player who went to a wrong country, led a wrong state, carrying contraband. Then in 2018, we had the 2018 Farm Bill, which changed the path. Instead of the DEA now for hemp, it's the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but still we're the FDA, which remember stands for the Food and Drug Administration. The drug threshold as a pharmaceutical is a considerably higher bar than a nutraceutical bar for food supplements. And that comes to light in terms of the way we present today. And the way that that particular 2018 Farm Bill delineated how much of Delta-9 THC right now, well, I'm sure will be discussed at other talks during this weekend about Delta-8 THC, which many of you may be hearing about. So this is a little comment about Delta-8 THC that you should know about, because this is at this moment in time a threat to public health. And I'm saying that because
how are you?
of the way it came to be.
Good.
You need
Did you
to
take care of
know
Mr.
that
Lee
Delta-8
Lawrence?
THC is a byproduct of that Farm Bill, which encouraged people to farm hemp in
Right.
all 50 states. It gets farmed. And that was in 2018. The big excitement was about CBD, a natural consequence of the plant's balanced chemistry where cannabidiol could be extracted and then sold. Except when you have now many states producing it, there became an overabundance of THC across the country. And so now the market prices of that dropped precipitously, CBD. And so chemists subjecting CBD to the chemical acids which created an isomer of Delta-9 THC called Delta-8 THC now is available across the country. I'm saying legally, but it truly is gray market because this is the very definition of what a designer drug is and does. It stays one step ahead of the existing law. Delta-8 THC, in contrast, here in Florida today, can be bought by an 11-year-old in a gas station.
Right.
So going right to the conclusion here, for a clinician, it's a balancing act, not only for licenses, but
Yeah,
how to advise
exactly.
patients.
No.
with clinical care. Dr. Cook at the end of the group here will be telling you some very exciting research. And so now it's my opportunity and privilege to first introduce Dr. Chris McCurdy is a professor of medicinal chemistry in the College of Pharmacy at the University of Florida. Dr. McCurdy, you're on, sir. Can you tell us about yourself and what you do?
Sure. See, can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm a professor of medicinal chemistry. That means I do drug design, not designer drugs. Of our sad joke. But really I call it drug architecture. So we design compounds to look at treatment of substance use disorders, primarily in my laboratory. We also do a lot of analytical chemistry and bioanalytical chemistry, particularly related to cannabis and hemp. We've developed methodologies by liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry to analyze cannabinoids and content in different plant materials so that we can look at plant that's grown in the state of Florida to ensure that it stays below that 0.3% THC threshold. We've been doing a lot of that work in collaboration with Zach that you'll hear from. And then we also do work on the bioanalysis side for medicinal evaluation of cannabis and looking at what blood level concentrations can be or urine concentrations of different cannabinoids as well. And so that's some of the work that we're doing. I also work in the space of kratom, kratom, which seems to be very, very much side by side with many of the cannabis products that are for sale. Not everybody selling cannabis sells kratom, but it seems that almost everybody that sells kratom sells cannabis products. So there's a fine line in between those, and we may talk about that a little bit more as well. And I'll pass it over to Zach. You want to introduce?
I met Dr. Brym really back in 2016, Florida legislature passed the hemp pilot project, and that's what brought hemp research to the University of Florida. In particular, I met Dr. Brym the following year in 2017. He's a wealth of knowledge, has certain constraints because of the academic affiliations for what we sort of understand between what impact research can have coming back to feed legislators the information they really need to make intelligent legislation. But I've served on a committee that he has for advising as a physician since its inception, and I learn more every day from what he does down not only in what we call our TREC station, which is down in Homestead, Florida, but the other fields throughout the state where they're growing hemp, recognizing that Florida has a diverse agricultural difference from the north part of the state to the south, very different. And that's one of the reasons we have agricultural extension offices through different counties, of which I'm even a Florida Master Gardener, but that's specific to Miami-Dade. Zach's where I am, but his input has been essential throughout the state as these hemp fields and the pilot projects work has progressed. So Zach, can you tell us more about what you do, what you're looking forward to do, and maybe even different tracks in your own department and institution going forward that I just heard about?
All right. Hey, everybody, is this close enough for you to hear me? I think so. All right. So I'm Zach Brym, assistant professor in the agronomy department. As Dr. Jeff mentioned, I work from the Tropical Research and Education Center down in Miami-Dade County. So that's our southernmost agricultural research station. What it says on my door is agroecology. So my interest is in plant diversity and how we can make those plant communities more productive, oftentimes through crops. So as was mentioned, the state of Florida, along with the movement in the federal legislature at the time, adopted a pilot project program for hemp production. And that meant an introduction of a new crop to the state. Of course, there's all the wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We know that it was here before 2019, but at least the fields that I planted in Homestead in 2019 were the first legal permitted hemp plantings for the state. We sort of jumped from that very quickly from Homestead to also include hemp plants across the state, research stations nearby Gainesville and in the Panhandle. And so my interests were very much about what is this plant as it relates to a potential commercial crop? How does it grow across the state? What kind of cropping systems, equipment, personnel, resources might a producer need in order to grow this plant? I am particularly interested in environmental impacts, and so a couple areas we've really narrowed in on, particularly the fertilizer use. You know, cannabis has all sorts of nicknames. One of them is weed, which makes people think it grows like a weed. That may be true in some fertile ditches, but as far as a commercial agricultural product, it requires fertilizer in order to grow robustly. And so as an industry, the producers really want to have an idea of how much fertilizer needs to be applied in order for commercial production, but also that you don't use too much so that it leaches out of the fields, provides that environmental impact. You heard about ditchweed from the Midwest. You know that it's still there after all those decades of historical cultivation. So it has escaped cultivation and poses a risk for agriculture in some of those states. So bringing a new plan in the state also posed the challenge, hey, what happens if Zach Brym's hemp fields in Homestead are the source of a whole bunch of new cannabis plants in the Everglades? So as an ecologist, we really tracked that stage as well. I guess the last thing to say based on this discussion that links hemp cultivation and production to public health is just the idea that these compounds come from a plant. And so depending on the extent to which that plant material is being processed into products is really going to impact the sort of work that Dr. Chris and I have done, where we've tracked the cannabinoid development in a plant across time. We've also tracked cannabinoids across varieties and different locations. So working with a plant, it becomes really challenging to get a consistent cannabinoid profile, one that might be appropriate for therapeutic uses. And so that's kind of where we meet in the middle.
Thanks, Zach. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term ditchweed, you're probably more familiar with what people classically described as cannabis sativa versus indica. We can dispel both those names later for what you'll actually find, which are hybrids. But cannabis ruderalis is generally what he's referring to. If you've ever seen that name before, it's stuff that got out, wild feral plants for the most part. And then finally, on the extreme end here, we have Dr. Cook. And I want to tell you about Dr. Cook a moment, because I have known the good work of the consortium for which he is the assistant professor. You know, it does work there as their associate director, but he's from UNC and then University of Virginia for medical school and University of Pittsburgh for an assistant professor. That's where I was thinking the word assistant. And now a professor at the University of Florida. Dr. Cook's unique because of all the researchers I was able to find through the consortium that's doing the legislatively required work in cannabis space. He's one of relatively few MD researchers, another Peter Holland from psychiatry, but Dr. Cook is an epidemiologist. He's the person through his master's in public health as an epidemiologist that really knows this public health terrain and why he's very valuable to this particular panel. So Dr. Cook, I don't know if I'm pronouncing, is it M3 or M cubed? Maybe why subtlety you can tell me, but I've had a chance more recently to find a little bit about not only the research that he's done, but what most excitingly is coming up. What can you tell us about yourself and the projects pertaining to cannabis?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me, Dr. Block. Hi to all of you in the audience. And if there's some people online, hi to you out there. So I am Bob Cook. I'm at the University of Florida. I was actually born in Gainesville before I did all that college, but never really lived here again until about 15 years ago. In my academic research career, I have been interested in alcohol and marijuana as exposures to health outcomes because they are both commonly used. People get enjoyment from them, and people can cite potential health benefits from them. But at the same time, a lot of people are concerned about potential risks that could be associated with it. And so coming in with a public health degree, I'm trying to keep an open mind and do research that looks at both the potential benefits, but also looks at some of the harms at the same time. It's kind of my belief, if you took 1,000 people and gave them all medical marijuana, some honestly really would get better. I know those of you who are physicians see that happen in your practice. Some might get worse, and we may not see them again because they don't follow up necessarily. And some people may have no effect. And that's kind of the science of epidemiology, is to try to really understand why some people benefit and some people don't. A lot of research, it's been very hard to do clinical trials. To me, the main reason to do clinical trial challenge has been the FDA, because if you study a health outcome such as pain or sleep, the FDA wants to be involved with the investigational drug application. And then we get in just a bunch of legal challenges in trying to get either hemp-based cannabinoid products or marijuana-based cannabinoid products approved for research by the FDA. So that's been a big barrier. At the university, a lot of people perceive that universities are afraid to do marijuana research. That's not been my experience. We realize there's a lot going on business-wise with cannabis in Florida, and I think the university has been supportive as long as we stay within the rules and laws. Cross-sectional studies are easy to do. You'll see a lot of people do surveys of people and ask if cannabis is helping them, and we'll often see a lot of positive responses in those surveys. But again, if you imagine that 1,000 people that I said you could survey, let's say they all tried medical marijuana and 300 of them had some side effect or quit. And then you only surveyed the people that were continuing to use marijuana and you asked them if it's helpful. You can see where you might have a selection bias, we call it, but there'd be a lot of people that say, yeah, it's helping me, because you're surveying people who are using it and who have found some benefit, and you're not surveying everybody. So the next type of study Dr. Block wanted me to mention is what we would call a longitudinal study. You could also call it a pre-post study, but we've been really interested in trying to enroll people who are interested in trying marijuana for health reasons, but who haven't been using it at least regularly in the past year or so that we can kind of get a baseline, anything from systemic measures of inflammation or cognitive assessments or survey questionnaires to assess things like pain or anxiety. We can even do experimental assessments of pain in the research study. But the longitudinal study allows us to get a baseline assessment and then to follow up and see what happens after people try it. And by enrolling people prospectively, we don't know if they're going to benefit or harm. We could look at both outcomes of benefit and harm. So we're doing 2 of these studies right now longitudinally. So one is supported by the Consortium for Medical Marijuana Clinical Outcomes Research. That was funded by the state of Florida in 2019. There are 9 consortium universities across the state that share these resources. The main goal of the resources is to support research. We also designed our own internal study that we call Medical Marijuana and Me, MMM or M cubed. In the Medical Marijuana and Me survey, we've been enrolling people from provider practices in Florida who either are current users, and we completed enrollment of 660 people. And then we also just completed enrollment of over 600 people who are newly getting a medical marijuana card in Florida. A subset of those people are experienced marijuana users before they got the card, and a subset of them are very new to marijuana. But we really are in the current process of collecting data like pre and post, things like pain, sleep, mood. I think it's going to be pretty strong data. The biggest criticism of this type of research still is that it lacks a comparison group or control group. You don't really know what would happen to people over time if you did nothing, or they said eat more Rice Krispies, they might have changes in health. So we did, my colleague Yan Wang, who's also an epidemiologist at UF, and I applied to the National Institute of Aging, NIH, and requested funding to do a prospective study of adults with chronic pain who have not really been able to get their pain relieved from other mechanisms. And so many of you who are physicians have seen patients like this. They're people that they've tried this, they've tried that, and they still have chronic pain. And so would marijuana help them? We, in a dream world, could do a clinical trial where we would give them a certain dose and placebo. But for this study, we are either going to enroll people who are going to start medical marijuana in Florida, or they're not. They're in a chronic pain clinic and they're not ready to start medical marijuana yet. So our control group will be people in chronic pain clinics or with similar types of chronic pain. We'll follow them for a year. And then the comparison group will be the people newly starting medical marijuana. We hope to enroll at least 100 people in both groups, collecting a lot of data. And in this case, our pilot data does suggest that at least for adults with chronic pain that really wasn't responding to other things, I think we do expect to see that many of them are going to benefit. Many of them are going to have improvements, reductions in other pain meds. But we're also tracking things to make sure that they don't become, have serious side effects that might send them to the emergency room, serious side effects that could interact with other medications they take, even becoming what I would say is addicted to cannabis, meaning that they want to stop and they can't stop. So we are looking for both the benefits and the harms. And this year, the last thing I'll say is the consortium really is actively eager to do randomized trials. We have lawyers involved at UF who are supporting this. We have our Office of Research is supporting this. We got our chemists, got our hemp growers. So there's a lot of momentum. It's just still really hard because for every time you get over one regulatory hurdle, there might be a state law that says, well, you can't give that person this product or something like that. So we're working hard, thinking of a couple of different trial designs, and looking forward to talking to some of you here at the conference to get your ideas of what should be our priorities for clinical research in Florida.
I want to point out something over the last 10 years, because those of you who were here when cannabis first came to Florida and wondering, oh, let's research this 10 years ago, the general feedback you'd get, not only from the University of Florida, but across academic institutions, not only throughout the state, but throughout the country, was a reluctance to want to research cannabis or even be involved with any studies because of a fear that if you were going to be researching a Schedule I prohibited substance, it might compromise your federal funding for other research you're doing not related to cannabis. That never panned out, did it? But I clearly remember your School of Pharmacy, when Florida first designated with data tracking that the School of Pharmacy at the University of Florida had to track the data of the users that was coming in and starting to establish the data. Your School of Pharmacy said, we do not necessarily want to do this. We are doing it because we are being mandated to do so. And then saying with the proviso, we may not even necessarily agree with this. But 10 years later, with nearly 1 million Florida citizen patients who are legally accessing it, they're not only a need, but without there ever having been a single episode of where the institutions have in fact had their funding pulled out for fear of that, never panned out to anything. So what you're seeing is an evolution of academic acceptance and the consequences from federal guidelines for funding. It's a learning curve. It doesn't happen instantly, and that's taken the better part of this past decade. So what I'd like to be able to do is I'm going to be asking some questions to the panelists here. If anybody has certain particular questions, rather than passing around a mic, I think index cards or something like that, I'm happy to share other material. But I know for a fact that, for instance, the pharmacist who's sitting next to me, I sort of understand where he's coming from. I'm an anesthesiologist. So I'm really a clinical pharmacist and physiologist. I know how the body works and how different drugs perturbate what the body's physiology is normally doing. And while we talked about briefly on a slide before about dosing and potency of things impacting outcome, pharmacy is essential in this. We'll have another speaker tomorrow morning and also on the closing panel on Sunday morning, Mahmoud El Soli, who is a pharmacist, but like me, he's a botanist. My bias is I raise tropical ornamental plants. I can't touch cannabis legally. So in this sense, old throwbacks perhaps to physicians or healers, forget the MD now a moment entirely, as botanists, where people had to know how to sustain plants, is part of how humans evolved. Because if the given healer in a given tribe in a primitive time didn't know how to sustain their plants, they would have lost their formulary. And then they're not regarded as a good healer or a plant person. So this goes way back historically to what healers are supposed to know about the health of their fellow man and how to take care of plants. So getting a little bit in terms of what you do, pharmacy meets healthcare. You want to tell us anything more about potency issues, maybe with, you mentioned kratom before, which I only now know is not kratom or kratom. And the only reason I'm bringing up this is, for those of you not familiar, another plant-derived chemical, but works with the endorphin system. This is not a cannabinoid. This is something that's being thought of as perhaps being helpful for opioid addiction as a step-down drug, but it still interacts in ways like buprenorphine, if anybody's familiar with that, except this is a plant-derived chemical. The reason it's kind of important in Florida is the legislator this past session didn't give it the thumbs up, go ahead, but said, you know what, we're not going to outlaw it necessarily. We're going to look into it and try to see what might really exist with kratom. So the stage is yours. Kratom, cannabis, potency relative to either, how these chemicals interact with our endogenous systems. As you well know, dosing with the opioids is a key reason for having that public health consequence of fatal deaths happening. That's not going to happen with cannabis derivatives, but even potentially kratom and other opioids work with that system where there are receptors in the brainstem controlling respiration. So can you educate us a little bit more?
So that's a lot of doors to open. But yes, so let's start with cannabis and hemp, really start with hemp, and talking about that and CBD and what the excitement was around CBD. And as Dr. Jeff alluded to earlier, there was such a overproduction of CBD and CBD products that it generated little demand anymore. So the price plummeted from where they thought it was going to be. And so as an industry, where did they turn to some alternatives that were still legal? And that's really into this gray area that we talk about with Delta 8. Delta 8 is synthesized from CBD. So it is purified from hemp products, and then it is synthesized. And it's synthesized in not the most pharmaceutically elegant way. So it's generated, and there's several byproducts that are generated with it, many of which are other types of cannabinoids that form that are not natural occurring cannabinoids. And so this can all cause issues from a public health standpoint. I think if we go back and we don't know what all is within the Delta 8 sort of production extract and what's available. Most of the products that are out there are not clean from that standpoint. So even though Delta 8 has been pushed as an interesting alternative, it can still get you high. It doesn't get you as highly or euphorically intense as Delta 9 does. But there's these byproducts of that chemical reaction that are sort of come along as baggage in that, and we don't understand the safety of those byproducts. So everybody touts it as being just Delta 8, but it's actually about anywhere from 10 to 20 other compounds that are within that Delta 8 product that have been generated as byproducts of that reaction. Yeah, Delta 8 is the major piece there, but we don't understand, coming back to this dose issue, we don't understand any of the science that's related to these other chemicals that are within there. And then take it to just Delta 8 itself. We don't fully understand the science around that and what proper doses are effective and what proper doses could result in harm. And that extends now, if we go into the medical space with medical marijuana, it's the same issue. Many of the clinical trials, or many of the studies that have been done, I should say, they're mostly preclinical studies at universities, were generated with marijuana cigarettes that have been provided by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Those marijuana cigarettes are grown at the University of Mississippi, which is the only legal federal marijuana farm at the time. Mahmoud El Soli, who was mentioned, is the director of that program. I had the pleasure of working side by side with him for 16 years before I came to University of Florida. So I've known him for a long time. I've understood that program for a very long time as well. But one of the goals of that program was really to generate these cigarettes, high potency, medium potency, and low potency, and then placebo cigarettes that were distributed for different studies, some human studies, but a lot of this was preclinical studies where we actually do some of these at the University of Florida now with Professor Barry Setlow, where they have a smoke chamber that they can use, which was set up for tobacco studies, but they actually smoke marijuana cigarettes in this chamber, and then rats are exposed to that smoke. So it's really secondhand smoke. And we can look at the levels of cannabinoids in those blood supply of that rat that result from that exposure. So there's many things that we can do in those cases, but those are limited by the quality of the marijuana cigarettes that we are able to obtain. And those are very low in their potency, even though they say high potency, medium, and low potency. The high potency cigarettes are not anywhere near what is being utilized in many of the dispensaries. And so we're not getting a true understanding of dose and efficacy because we're limited to using that. And so there are still some barriers that were mentioned with the sort of ability for us to conduct cannabis research because we cannot go to a dispensary and obtain products, bring them onto campus, and then utilize those in our research. So there's still that firewall sort of barrier that limits what we're able to do. We can't even buy the products, bring it in, and do the analysis on those because legally it's still considered to be federally illegal, and even though it's legal in the state. So there's still some gray area there. We can obtain cannabis, but like I said, it has to come from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and it has to be in that program. The good news about that, and maybe Dr. El Soli can address this later on in the conference, the National Institute on Drug Abuse this year readjusted the contract for the first time ever, and now are asking for higher potency cultivars to be grown and products to be made available for research purposes, realizing that big gap in understanding of dose being available in controlled settings. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the cannabis space. And we can look at isolated Delta-9, we can look at isolated CBD, we can look at isolated Delta-8, we can look at CBD products that are full spectrum, broad spectrum, or isolates. All of these things we can do within the laboratory setting, but we can't do the full-on, medical marijuana that's being dispensed in dispensaries. And so there's still this big gap in research, even on the preclinical, but certainly on the clinical side, to look at those things. And so if we jump over to kratom, which I mentioned, or kratom, it's all sort of tomatoes, as long as we all know what we're talking about. Kratom is interesting because it's a plant that was native to Thailand, Malaysia, Southeast Asia. This plant was used for centuries to provide a stimulant effect to outdoor laborers, to help them work in the hot sun and in the outdoor environment and tolerate the heat and the pain that came along with a lot of that agricultural work. And it's been, like I said, used for centuries. It was outlawed in Thailand in the 1940s because it was actually cutting into their opium tax revenue. And then just recently, a couple of years ago, Thailand reversed the course and made this product legal again because they realized the market was so large, and Indonesia is actually where most of the material is coming from, Southeast Asia, and Malaysia and Thailand both decided that they were missing an economic opportunity in global trade. And that brings up lots of policy issues because currently the FDA has an import ban on, or it's really an export ban on kratom. And so it is not legal to bring into the United States. However, there's estimated a little over 2,000 metric tons of that product coming into the US per month. It's not policed. There's not enough people in customs or border control to be policing that area. A lot of that material is being imported under the guise that it is sodium alginate. Sodium alginate is a byproduct of seaweed that is used in the cooking industry. And so it's a green powder. It looks just like the green powder that's kratom. So that comes in. And then we get into dosing with kratom. And so there's been, as I mentioned, there's been centuries of use in Southeast Asia. There's never been reports of harm or death associated with the use. But then this product has made its way into the United States and into the Western world, and we're starting to see deaths associated with its use or associated with other substances in combination with its use. They're still very few and far between if we look at the total number of deaths per total number of users or estimated users. And there's really not any that have been fully linked to kratom just by itself. I will say, though, that we know what typical users in Southeast Asia, what their exposures are, how they consume the product, what their blood levels of the major alkaloid called mitragynine, what their normal blood levels are for that. And again, they're using it more or less in the same fashion that we use coffee here in the United States. So they're drinking it in the morning, in the mid-morning, and then in the early afternoon. And their blood levels max out around 120 nanograms per milliliter of mitragynine, that major alkaloid. What we've seen in some tox reports here in the United States is that 120, which is sort of a high end for normal users in Malaysia, we've seen autopsy reports with over 3,000 nanograms per mil in systems in the United States. And so, you know, we talk about the dose and being a medicine and being beneficial versus the dose that can be the poison and the harmful aspect of it. And so that's a huge window to drive through when you're looking at normal users around 120 nanograms per milliliter, and then fatalities in the 3,000 nanograms per milliliter. There's a huge window there that we need to understand. Where does the harm start to creep its way in? Where do these fatalities or the dangers start to emerge from? And it's all related to dose. And we just don't have a full understanding. The good news is, unlike cannabis, kratom right now is not scheduled by the Controlled Substances Act, so it is available for research. There are clinical trials going on. Ironically, the FDA is conducting a clinical trial, or supporting conducting a clinical trial, where first they will have to determine that kratom is safe, which they have been hammering the drum on that it's not safe. And so in order for them to show that it has abuse potential, they first have to demonstrate that it's safe to get to that point. So this will be an interesting time to see how FDA policy or FDA thought processes start to evolve around kratom as well. They're doing other clinical trials that are on the books and being scheduled to really investigate that. We are conducting a clinical trial at the University of Florida in the vet school, looking at kratom for treating dogs, companion dogs, for osteoarthritis. I can't really speak to how all that's going, but it's going pretty well. I don't know what else to really go for here, but there are a lot of mechanisms that are involved in our endogenous system. So our bodies interact with these chemicals. We talked about opioids, or opiate system, endorphin system. Indeed, some of the alkaloids that are within kratom interact with that system, but they're very unique because they're not purely opioidergic. So they don't behave just like morphine or oxycodone or fentanyl. those molecules directly target the opioid system and don't target any other systems. The alkaloids that are in kratom weakly activate opioid receptors, but they also interact with other receptors in our body, like adrenergic receptors, which are our fight or flight sort of mechanisms and give us stimulant type activity. And they also interact with serotonin receptors, which are involved in mood and mood stabilization, mood enhancement. A lot of individuals that use kratom say they have this elevated mood, elevated activity, so the stimulant-like effect. And again, it's at this low dose where that seems to be occurring. And that start low and go slow is the same sort of advice in the kratom world, which is start low and hopefully don't go too high, because what most users are saying is less is more. So they're actually getting more benefit from taking less amounts than increasing amounts, and using pure leaf material and not using concentrated extracts or other products that are really concentrated in the formulation. So we don't understand really the differences or the dangers that are associated with those concentrated extracts, but we do know that there is a much more likelihood that you would get harm resultant from using an extract product. So it's very concentrated. So you can think of it like a very nice light beer is the kratom leaf material, where you can get some sort of effect. And then you can think of these extracts as really like 151 proof alcohol, where if you were to drink 12 ounces of each, the 12-ounce beer isn't going to do much to you, but 12 ounces of that 151, you probably won't make it through that whole thing. So it's, again, it comes down to this whole area of dose versus benefit versus poison. So I think I'll stop there.
I just want to add a few things to complement Dr. McCurdy, because he's just explained to you, well, really 3 different systems. You've got cannabinoids, endorphins, and now we brought alcohol into it. And the important message about alcohol, because we know a lot about alcohol intoxication, impaired driving, and things like that. Those of you who may not remember, zero order kinetics just means that your body can only handle so much alcohol in a period of time, and it's an integral related process. But first order kinetics, which is about everything else follows, means your body, our bodies are tremendous in terms of being able to adapt to higher doses. It doesn't take twice as long with other drugs to metabolize 2 times as much the way it would with alcohol. It takes somewhat less than that. And that's just part of first order kinetics. So the differences in terms of the way we handle different drugs metabolically is huge, where alcohol is the exception that way. That's why people can have such poisonings happen if they have too much suddenly, and what binge drinking does that way. But here's the real problem with what all of these researchers and academicians are confronted with. When they're starting with the project, which is usually several years in duration, the plant itself is changing dramatically during the time they're doing their research, such that by the time their work's done and they make a disposition, the plant is no longer the same animal it was years before. I went to high school in the early 1970s, and if you don't think the plant's changed since then, it has. When you have a plant that can be genetically changed, Mendelian genetics now, to go from 3 or maybe 4% delta-9 THC to now pushing 25%. And I'm not going to get into the nuances of 25 or 28. That's what sells and goes off the shelves fast. But it's actually a remarkable feat of the biology and the botany that goes into selecting things, that a single secondary metabolite, delta-9 THC, can be produced where it's 25% of the dry weight of that flower. I want you to understand this. You can push things to a limit that is germane to what they're doing, because by the time they're done, it's a new product. And we know an awful lot about what delta-9 does from the research for almost 50 years in the 3, 4, maybe as much as 5% THC. We don't really know what the same exposure of 25% THC does long-term, which is why Dr. Cook's studies going forward for longitudinal is so important. What I can tell you about a longitudinal study, for those of you who are not familiar with the Dunedin study, and we're not talking Dunedin, Florida, we're talking New Zealand in the mid-70s, and then following the same group of kids who started using a lot of, didn't have to be, didn't have 25% THC pot then, but you follow that same group from a mid-teenager, 15, and then by the time they're 30 years old, that's important data because now you've tracked it. And you know what? It's not a perfect study, but there are very few other longitudinal studies. And that one that shows that they could track their IQ. And that at the end, you had this subset who started then and didn't stop. And there was an 8-point difference in IQ. I want to remind you what that measures. An 8-point drop in IQ from 100, which is the mean, remember that, to 92 is not like you take a test and you go from a high A to a low A. 100 on an IQ on a bell-shaped curve is the mean right up here. So you drop 8 points down to 92 and you've gone from the 50th percentile to the 28th percentile. Now think about that a moment. I got 2 boys, twins, who are 18 years old. Next month, they're going to Gainesville to go to school. And do you think I want to tell them at that age, hey, you know what? Why don't you try this? No, because you don't know where they're going to wind out. And I'm not going to want them to try something where they may just wind out as the 28th sharpest pencil in a box, potentially of 100, when they're starting out their college life. So dose makes a difference. We push the plant somewhere. I don't know where the kratom's going to be in the future, but I promise you, if it gets into farming, you may see that chemical feature differently. So it's a dynamic field that the researchers of botanical medicines, in this case, are with. The reason botanical medicines fell out of favor, they were very much in favor during the 19th century, but as the 20th century evolved, botanical medicines are very hard to standardize. Remember that. And it did not fit with the Controlled Substances Act's goal, which is largely through big pharma, that would produce one drug, one molecule to treat one disease and one patent. That's the model that the Controlled Substances Act really follows. So how do you really figure where does cannabis fit in that Controlled Substances Act? Probably nowhere. If there was a Schedule 6 maybe, and you can devise it to account for 2 key things. It's not one chemical, but a potpourri of them. And don't get me started about terpenes yet, that'll be tomorrow. But for now, you're looking at something that clearly doesn't fit into any definition of other controlled substance categories, and that's a big problem. So going forward then, from where we went from pharmacy to hemp, which is where Dr. Brym, I got to find some right questions or things to steer your way. So,
Yeah.
so
Actually, if I could segue a little
go
bit,
ahead.
just a little bit. I think one of the beauties of being able to work with the full spectrum of growing through the chemistry and understanding what's going on in animals, and then having the human component all in the University of Florida is one, fascinating, but two, it's great for us to work with the growers, the horticulturists and the agronomists, so that we can understand what the requirements are to manipulate those levels of compounds within those plants, or even to genetically be able to look at those plants and understand what biosynthetic pathways are in those plants and how those can be manipulated to produce different ranges of chemical profiles, or what we call chemotypes of those plant materials. And so we've been talking about this, where as we learn more about what certain chemicals are producing in terms of biological effects, can we generate certain strains? Of course, it's being done in cannabis much more so right now, but can we even do that in the kratom area to generate a mood elevating strain, or just a pain treatment strain, or whatever have you? But that's the key of having such great colleagues in our plant world to work with. And so I can segue to Zach.
Well, Dr. McCurdy was speaking about his early formative years working with the University of Mississippi, and where NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, for all of those years had to, by convention, get all of their research material. And while Dr. El Soli will be with here, I'll show you that this book came out on Monday. Dr. El Soli is the editor. It's an entire book on cannabis chemistry and biology fundamentals, graduate level book. If you'd like to get it, I will tell you that I was honored. About a year ago, he gave me a call and said, Jeff, I'd like you to write the opening chapter to my book. And I wanted to have some of the history, not only of cannabis, but how you present it in terms of evolution, because the fact is, cannabis is unique from other plants. Plants have to find a way to get around the world or outside of their environment because they're existentially rooted to where they're at. So something comes along and threatens it, a storm, an ice age, an animal eating it up. It has to find a way to go from this point to that point. So things like ferns have little spores, the wind brings it from here to there. Or fruits, where an animal eats a fruit and defecates the seed someplace else, the plant grows over there. Cannabis found its way around the world with human agriculture. That's well documented. 6,000 years of documented human agriculture. And the reason that that's important is it found its way here, and it went through iterations throughout the time. It went to different continents throughout the world and was farmed by people who probably had particular uses for the way they achieved keeping it in cultivation. And it wasn't the same plant probably for them as they may have started with 1,000 years before. And we're only looking at a blip of time, 50 years since the Controlled Substance Act to what we've changed with the modern contemporary cannabis plant. So I'll tell you the chapter name for the first chapter here is The History of Cannabis, a Story of Coevolution and Human Discovery. This plant co-evolved with human beings and changed along the way, most dramatically in the last 50 years for marijuana. But most of those 6,000 years had nothing to do with marijuana, it had everything to do with hemp as a textile. It found its way here with Columbus's ships, sails, and riggings, all made from hemp. Resurrected even after the cannabis was made illegal with the 1937 Tax Act during World War II. Hemp for victory. This was farmed in order to produce it again as a textile because of its value that way. So I was honored to watch when Dr. Brym brought seeds in, 42, I think, seeds from around the world. And they can do this because of academia. And let's see how they do here in South Florida. We're in Miami. So if memory serves, we had some seeds of cannabis that were not only growing and germinating from seed, but flowering inside of just 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Now, imagine what would happen if that got loose. Now, I'm not talking about as a drug form. I'm talking about as an environmental hazard. This is still public health. Has anybody seen our South Florida pythons, how healthy they are lately? You see where I'm going? So Dr. Brym will tell you more, not only about the potential for it being an invasive species, not ditchweed like we're used to in different parts, and particularly in Europe, is where ditchweed is ruderalis evolved, and that was a hemp product. But here in the United States, the Everglades ecosystem is particularly rich. There's some problems growing it in such a humid environment that he might want to go more into. But there are other things that hemp is noted for. Its fast growth can help with something called phytoremediation. And Dr. Brym can tell you more about that, but it's really good in sucking heavy metals out of areas where agriculturally they may have been as contaminants. Nobody's talking about that. It's good for other things, making sugar substitutes, even building substances. For those of you who may have heard of hempcrete. But make no doubt about it, the 2018 Farm Bill released the hounds for producing a chemical CBD that now is being changed with the Delta 8. There's a whole lot of other uses for hemp that are very exciting with modern technology that have nothing to do with drugs. So Dr. Brym, anything you want to tell us about cadmium as a heavy metal or something like that?
How much time do we have left?
You've got 50 seconds. You got a lot of time. We're doing pretty good here.
Yeah, there's again a lot to doors to open with that. Maybe the first that I would start with, which is the idea of this plant botanically. So let's all agree that hemp and marijuana are the same plant. Okay, botanically, cannabis sativa. There are ways to define that, both from a biological perspective and from a legal perspective, how hemp and marijuana would be different. And that's really where the rub of our jobs come into play. And so what happened was a study in the early days, the 1970s. A scientist came along, he collected cannabis from across the world and he grew them up. And he found a distinction which was roughly around 0.3% THC, delta 9 THC. And that sort of single study has been propagated across the world as the legal definition between hemp and marijuana. The highest delta 9 THC in that collection was something like 5%. And so what's happened is this arbitrary distinction legally in the United States and replicated globally of this 0.3s. So what does that mean for farmers? What does that mean for the system that we found ourselves in? As a university research at Florida, I have a permit to be a hemp producer. So any plant that I have that exceeds that 0.3% THC is now no longer defined legally as hemp. It's out of compliance and I have to destroy it. There's that rolling joke there where, okay, tell me where your illegal hemp fields are so I can go to witness the destructive burn. That is a compliant
was
USDA
sniffing there if you
destructive
caught that.
procedure is to burn your fields. But really what it comes down to is this nuanced discussion with producers that comes down to harvesting at the right time. So based on this distinction of 0.3, you might expect that hemp plants are reliably below 0.3% and marijuana plants are reliably above. We don't experience that, right? We agree that this is the same plant. And so the breeding that's happened and the genetics that has happened to push some of the cannabis lines, the marijuana lines towards a high CBD producing plant hasn't reconciled some of the biology in the plant that would be needed. So it's just another one of those areas that have made it challenging for farmers and the industry to go forward. An interesting point just that arises I wanted to mention, working at the University of Florida, particularly in the ag school, it's very clearly articulated that part of my salary is federal funds. And so as Doc Block was mentioning, there is sort of this additional layer of the university bureaucracy where I have to not only be clear within my role as a state of Florida researcher and employee, but also partially employed by the federal government. So that's sort of one plant specific idea to be thinking about. And not only do some of these high CBD producing plants exceed 0.3% THC within less than 3 weeks of flowering. To jump to the chase, that's not a viable commercial product. But we also see some of the genetics that don't match that put on flowers within 3 weeks of being put out. So there's a lot of that issue there. The idea of phytoremediation just really articulates the amazing opportunity that cannabis can be so many things to so many industries. So hemp, as we consider it from the industrial side, or at least for industrial uses, is the hemp for fiber or plant material, the hemp for seed and seed oil. And by and large, those plants look very different than plants that are being produced for cannabinoids. And so from a cropping system perspective, we can really distinguish that. Many of those plants have also been identified as taking up heavy metals. So cadmium is probably the one that's been best established. Non-detectable levels of cadmium in the soil can result in detectable levels of cadmium in the plant. To what extent those heavy metals move from the plant roots into the plant leaves and then into the plant flowers is still a little bit of an unknown situation. And so as we're developing hemp products or cannabis products, being very clear that we have those sorts of testing scenarios in place to track those potential contaminants or toxins, I think is a really critical aspect when we're linking plant cultivation and production to these sorts of medical and public health situations. So.
And for those of you who didn't just pick on what he said, you can use the plant to pull heavy metals out, and now it's in the content of the plant itself. Probably not the best idea to start taking it internally. So one use is not necessarily the use for you to take the plant into your own body.
Yeah.
But now what I want to do to sort of segue to Dr. Cook is to give you a little better insight as a clinician. I'm not the academician, I'm predominantly a clinician. And those of you here who may see patients for certifications and you're acting as a clinician, a moment ago you were mentioning, I forgot if it was Dr. McCurdy or Dr. Brym, about that everything is still cannabis, marijuana, cannabis, cannabis sativa L, as described going back to the middle 1700s, Linnaeus. I want to just give a little comment about sativa, indica, things like that. I promise you everything you find in any of the commercial stores are all hybrids. And it's because of all this breeding and interbreeding over the last 50 years. I'll show some slides on a talk I'm giving tomorrow. It's a little more specific. But what you need to know about that is if everything is in fact the same parent plant, cannabis sativa, it means, what does the name indica really mean, other than that people know effects of an indica, but it's really quite improper to call something by that name because it is not a species at this point of what you're actually seeing. Was it ever so distinct? Possibly, but at least not in Linnaeus terms where he described it. They're probably all, again, because of human agriculture, things that different human beings brought to different parts of the world and cultivated for their needs. And it did well, not only for their needs, but was growing better, more efficiently in the environments that they were growing it in. Cannabis can grow in tremendously different environments, altitudes, things like that. And it's a weed. It comes up everywhere, not just as dishweed, but as what we're familiar with the intoxicating plant versus the industrial textile plant. So where does that connect to Dr. El Sole? Well, in April of 2020, in the journal Nature, which is a highly respected journal, Dr. El Sole wrote a paper along with 5 representatives from the United States Pharmacopoeia. And for those of you who are not familiar with the USP, the United States Pharmacopoeia, that's our federal government's guideline on not just plants, but medicines in general. It's their tone. And cannabis as a plant was removed from the United States Pharmacopoeia as a result of the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, such that the 1942 edition, which I have a copy at home, doesn't have it in it. And from that point forward, the federal government has really not provided us with the information that we would need to intelligently go forward, not just the last 50 years since the Controlled Substance Act, but going back to the late 1930s. So there's a problem when something gets vilified and politically mixed up when the education is taken away, and that's why we're all here, where we look for guidance from the federal governments, which brings me back to this El Sole paper. For those of you who would like to know where you should be just a few years from now, when it does finally come out of federal prohibition, you would look at cannabis not being described as indica sativa, but generally in 3 groups. And this is what this paper delineated. You could look it up, April 2020, El Sole, along with, again, this is the key point, 5 of the contributing authors, and they will put their disclaimer saying, we are not speaking on behalf of the USP, but there's a reason they're co-authors. And I think it's going to bode well for you to pay attention to that, because I firmly believe this will be the position of the federal government going forward. You have 3 groups of plants. One group is that which features THC dominating in the plant. Another group would be those which feature CBD, the other primary cannabinoid featured in the plant. So you have THC and CBD. The therapeutics, if you look at old landrace fields in other parts of the world, were not necessarily the real strong plant that only had THC expression or only CBD. They were ones that had a balance between both. And if you understand the function and purpose of the endocannabinoid system, there's an ironic correlate to the plant balance that used to exist, but has been lost now in favor of the THC side, more recently discovering the CBD side. So the intermediates, otherwise called one-to-ones, if you're going to look at it that way, that's really where the therapeutics lie. And that is the 3rd group that the El Sole and the USP contributing authors identified. If I were a clinician seeing patients, and I don't see patients for certifications, but I do know something about the subject, that's where I'd be starting nearly everybody. And then from that starting point, you can deviate off to one side or the other towards THC, more CBD. But that you should expect will be the basic layout in the future of how we look at plants, not indica, sativa, things like that. It's frankly silly because they're all hybrids. So if the hybrid expresses THC, 1, CBD expression, 2. The secret therapeutically going forward is probably returning to the sensibility that the plant evolved with human agriculture for much of the past 6,000 years, those intermediates, the 1-to-1s. That's the balance secret. That's why the CBD and the cannabidiol having features with cannabidiol as an anxiolytic offset the THC's principal side effect that many people have of being jittery and maybe panicky or paranoid. One balances the other to come up with a safer final product, generally of lower potency, but those intermediates, that third group that I've mentioned, is where I believe you'll see a category evolving for how to approach cannabis rather than calling them what they're not, indica versus sativa, when everything's hybrid.
May I add something?
Sure, please.
Just an interesting note. So the sort of chemists came along and put together this classification based on the way the plant appears from its chemistry. Similarly, at the same time, there was also work to look into the genetics of that. And the chemistry matches the genetics in a way very interesting in that there is a gene to make the CBD, and there is another gene to make the THC, and they happen to be very closely aligned in the genome, so that you sort of can't turn both of them off in a way, because the genes are also a little bit what they call leaky. So the THC gene makes a little bit of CBD, and the CBD gene makes a little bit of THC, and so those are the golden ratios that we're seeing in some of our plants at the extreme. And then what happens in the chemotype is whether or not you have 2 of the THC genes, 1-to-1, or 2 of the CBD genes. So really interesting to see sort of alignment in the story as it's come along in the last couple of years.
And one last comment, Dr. Brym just used the word chemotype. That's a very accurate word for you scientists out there who want to know what you should call the plant. You'll see many people referring to strains. Strains refer to bacteria and viruses. They do not refer to different plant hybrids. Chemotypes, cultivars really is what we're talking about. The hybrids are cultivars, but because we're looking at the chemicals in those cultivars, the best word you could use to describe one plant or another is based on their chemotype. And that's why I'm glad you just used that word there. So where does this all translate into in terms of human beings and therapeutics, and everything that Dr. Cook at the end of the aisle here was telling you about his studies, the basis of longitudinal studies, the importance of it. It's a hard field for somebody like Dr. Cook, if he was a moment in time and had to give you, this is what you need to know today, when it's taken him perhaps years to come to that conclusion. And the plant we're talking about today is no longer the plant that he researched when he started off. So longitudinal studies not only follow the individual, but we've got to find ways to, and this is the hardest challenge of all, to keep up with what's happening with the plant and the way people are using it. It's not only smoking, it's not only vaping, it's edibles, salves, everything else. So the best way I can tell you to go forward with respect to things as basic as policy. Now I'm talking about things that determine how physicians in Florida, where you're licensed, have your largest group of physicians through the Florida Medical Association determining policies on cannabis. Policies need to reflect current law and current science, and policies that linger on from years ago are not effective in either of those two categories because cannabis is evolving so quickly. So understanding that, any tips on how you keep up with such a dynamic landscape, Dr. Cook? This is a real tough question.
Well, I don't know if exactly I'm going to answer your question, but I would say that challenge of a researcher in doing something as basic as saying, do we need CBD? If you're a clinician, would you tell the person you should take CBD twice a day in addition to whatever else you get? Or take THC in combination with CBD 1-to-1 ratio. I mean, there's a lot of hype that would say it makes sense. There's a lot of hype that says CBD is going to be more anti-inflammatory and THC is going to be more of a, head high or something like that. But the hard data are really hard to come by. We don't really have a lot of clinical data comparing CBD alone to THC to the combination. So one of the clinical trials I'm really trying to push is that basic question. Another basic fundamental question to me is the entourage effect or an isolate. So if you go to dispensaries in Florida, there are many products that are just THC products or just CBD products without, and then you could also, maybe it's marketing, maybe it's real, but you could get rosins or RSO or things that have more of the entourage product. So most of us, I think, who are botany natural plant, it's easy for us to imagine that the entourage is true and that would be healthier, but we still don't really have a lot of hard data on that. We know that people who take Marinol, for example, which is a synthetic THC, often would say, well, I don't feel the same. I don't feel the same way as I do with real pot. And so I think another challenge is distinguishing true therapeutic effects versus how people feel. It's a really unique aspect to cannabis that most of the conditions we treat are symptoms. They're not diseases. In contrast to a lot of other medicine, which is, treating things like diabetes or congestive heart failure. So we're treating symptoms, and it makes sense that people would titrate to do their symptoms, whereas standard medicine doesn't do that. So to distinguish, the effects of, we did do a survey and asked these 600 people. Most of them said they were using it for chronic pain, anxiety, or sleep, which, again, as you know, aren't the official indications for marijuana in Florida, but they are the reasons that people say they're using it. And when we asked them what was the most effective, all categories, flower came out number one, most effective. So what is it about the flower, and how could we study that? That's a great question. And even if I go to the dispensary and it says it's 20% THC, that just means that from that batch, at least one flower had that, but there's a lot of other flowers from the same batch. So this is where the FDA is going to have a hard time saying we can't control exactly how much the individual consumer is going to get. So potentially we need to get into a mindset that flower is flower, and 3 hits of flower is 3 hits of flower. I've been reading a documentary about the Grateful Dead in the 1969. They were getting stoned off of whatever pot that was. So you can say, oh, it was weak, it was nothing. Maybe they consumed more. Maybe it was the terpenes in the plant. Maybe there was something else in the plant that got them high. But I think for us to just say, well, the flower today is a lot different is making it a little complicated for research. But the data do show that a 6% THC cigarette will affect people acutely more than a 1% cigarette versus a placebo in a lab. If I have people smoke this and do some psychological tests in the lab or report pain scores or how high they feel or how nauseated they feel, we certainly do know that differences in THC will affect that. But the challenge in studying the terpenes and the other, whole flower versus not, is something I think we're going to only be able to do by sending people out in the real world and saying, you're randomized to do flower 3 times a day. You're randomized to do vape 3 times a day. And let's see if you get a difference with isolate, or we could try to get people to use products in the real world. And that's something that I think we're going to need to do in research, and not have people take experimental drugs that we typically do. I think we really want the effect. The final thing I'll say that's a challenge is that we also see that individual preferences and individual experiences vary so much, so that if we gave everyone in the room a joint that had triangle kush in it, and we said, take 2 hits, some of you would say, wow, this is awesome. I feel great. Some of you might say, I feel really sleepy. Some of you might say, my eyes are burning. Some of you might say, I feel relaxed, but the effects are very different. And so that also makes it really hard for us to study and find that signal. But we, the consortium, our director, Alma Winterstein, goes every year and she sits down and the first question they say is, you got any data to say whether it works or not? And we still struggle with that basic question. Do we got any data to show whether it works or not?
Dr. Cook brought up a few key words there. Again, I'm a clinician, so now I'm going to speak to those of you out there trying to assess what you see. Mentioned the word on entourage. And of course, we really hadn't started to talk much about entourage yet. I've had a talk with a few people who popularized that word, including Rafi Meshulam and Ethan Russo. And Ethan Russo brought to light many of the impacts of terpenes. So it's not simply the interactions between the cannabinoids we talked about, but terpenes and different ones. But let's shift gears a moment to you as clinicians, where you're trying to make some assessment of what you're describing is how do you assess outcome? If you look generally at what people say they're taking cannabis for, and I'm not talking about a qualifying condition in the state of Florida that has to include PTSD versus glaucoma versus this or that. My fellowship was in pain management, but back in the days when it used to be taught along with addiction medicine, it was before there were subspecialty boards. Anesthesia then went on to be interventional pain management, and addictionology went the way of psychiatry. So we in academia are guilty of being what's called siloed. Okay, got so many different disciplines that are so specified that one professor in the department may not really have any idea what another's doing. Hence Dr. Winterstein's comment about, well, what do you really got? Give me the big answer. Well, you're all confronted when you see patients with the big answer of what you're looking for, which is generally, do you have a good understanding if somebody is generally taking it for what they perceive as pain? And you notice pain is not a qualifying condition because it's not a diagnosis at all. It's a condition resulting from diseases and injuries, yes, but it of itself isn't really a diagnosis that way. So Dr. El-Solia's book I just showed you, he wrote a real nice testimonial for me years before in this book, Advanced Therapeutics in Pain Medicine, which is basically an integrative management of pain book, 25 chapters. Chapter 4, I authored on cannabis. And we talk about things like entourage. And personally, I like the word ensemble, another E word, yes. But entourage sort of means that THC is the leader and everything else follows. I'm not convinced of that. There's so many other important cannabinoids, CBD and terpenes, that it's really an ensemble if you think about it, because a full orchestration of the plant's chemicals is really what produces the final result in the user. And the end user may prefer a plant that has a different profile, different terpene profile, even if they have exactly the same THC and CBD balance or imbalance. So the importance of smells to the way we perceive things is really central. I mean, if you think about where the olfactory nerve is and what part of the brain it interplays with, you may think that humans compared to dogs, no, we don't have a good sense of smell. Yeah, we do. And that's why somebody will tell you when they're going to a store, they're sniffing something. Ugh, I don't want that. I'll try that. You see it every day if you're in a dispensary where people are allowed to put their nose in it, which during COVID is probably not the best point to do that. But I'm going to point out now the confounders that you have in assessing pain as clinicians, because the thing we haven't talked about yet is what THC in particular is very well known to do. It impairs memory. Same part of your brain, the hippocampus, amygdala, all those emotional and central areas that determine what you're actually able to forget. I didn't say that you have to forget, but forgetting is a valuable tool. And yet cannabis creates forgetfulness. Probably the reason PTSD patients use it. So let's say you're going to assess a patient and they come in and you're talking about a moment ago, you have a patient try a joint, tell you how you feel while they're in the office with you. You get the immediacy of the patient saying, I feel better now. Not necessarily Grateful Dead, but I feel better now. But now you have a tremendous confounder. It's the placebo effect of euphoria. And mind you, there's nothing wrong with euphoria in itself to treat something painful, but I'd like you to think about pain in a minute. Instead of being pain, which most physicians think about from a physical perspective, to pain really being an intolerable symptom. And now an intolerable symptom can be physical, it can also be psychological. For some people's beliefs, it could even be spiritual. And I bet you'll find that the patients who are coming to you are telling you why they use cannabis are actually mentioning the way it makes them feel psychologically or spiritually, not necessarily with a physical correlate that you can find to confirm on an MRI. And you know where I'm going with this. So let's say you try it in your office, hour or so later, you're assessing, they tell you, yeah, I feel better. Hard to really assess that clinically for Dr. Winterstein because of that placebo effect of euphoria. So instead, you tell them, you know what? Here's your certification. Go out and try this. Come back next month. You don't have to wait the maximum number or minimum number. Come back next month. Tell me how you're doing. Now they're going to come back to you and you're asking them to give you a report on how they felt the last month while consuming something that you know that is well known to make them forget. So how reliable is your data coming back from someone who now is going to be forgetting as a result of the consequence of using the very thing? So whether you're doing it now or later, assessing for if it's really working is tough, really tough. And so I credit all of you who see patients to try to make that determination. But it's one of the reasons that studying this gets to be so tough. So I'm bringing up what should be kind of obvious, but trying to share with you, having done my fellowship in pain. Please don't think about pain as only being physical. And I know that most people in this room don't, because you're too savvy and you're too connected with your patients to know why your patients are actually using it and probably getting therapeutic benefits from it. But boy, it's confounding research. And it's all part of the bigger discussion when you pull this apart and look how challenging it is to study this particular medicine, because it's not one medicine.
I'll just
it's a combination.
May I make another quick comment just about the research that is out there in pain? There's been several meta-analyses and national pain organizations, international pain organizations who have made summaries of the literature and commented on whether or not the data show a benefit. And a lot of the recent conclusions have been that the data do not show a benefit in pain. And again, many of you who are clinicians would just scratch your heads and say, well, that doesn't make sense because I'm seeing it. But we did qualitative interviews with people who had been using marijuana for pain, and these were more adults with chronic disease. And they were describing that it didn't necessarily stop the pain, but that they felt less stiff, or they psychologically weren't worried about it as more, or whereas they used to just hang out in their bedroom and now they wanted to come out and interact with people. And so their lives seemed a lot better from these qualitative interviews, but our measures in research are often still like on a scale of 1 to 100, how much pain did you average yesterday? And so it doesn't necessarily stop the pain, but it seems to have these other aspects that people say, I feel better. And what's wrong with that? Is it euphoria, or are they actually something happening? It's hard to tell, but I just think we need to improve our measures for some of these things, because just the pain scores themselves don't get it. Plus, a lot of the meta-analyses that you'll see are only looking at things that are commercial products. So they may have looked at Marinol, they may have looked at a product called Sativex, which is a 1-to-1 THC CBD spray, but nobody's publishing data on marijuana flower, for example, in pain, except for some very controlled experiments, and that's just very acute pain in a lab setting. So we really do need to find ways to study the long-term effect on both the pain, but also the functioning and how people live. And I wish we could do those studies, because right now I look at summary after, so maybe you can comment on how do you as an anesthesiologist advocate for marijuana when the pain societies are saying it doesn't work?
Well, I try not to advocate for anything. I'd rather just educate on it, because it gives a different bias to even my answer to your question. Anybody remember something called gate closure theory in pain? gate closures, what happens? You bang your knee into a door, and after you say a 4-letter expletive, what do you reflexly do? You rub it, because you're giving a different sensation that closes maybe the pain by giving you another sensation that doesn't hurt, the rubbing. That's the way we all do things without thinking, but that's the way the body really works. Now, I can put a white lab rat on an electrified grid and make pain in that lab animal and do all the research in a lab with animals I want. And good models for animals are very important for researchers, and we have them for cannabis. But with all the people out there using it, I'm not so sure I really care what it does to a lab rat. You got to just look at people. So what do people do? What you're describing with the way the pain is no longer front and center, but in the background, is exactly what you're doing with gate closure. It's called distraction. You're activating other parts of the brain, a creative side, an engaging side. So you're doing those things in life that you have to do to get along. And no longer is the pain front and center. I still feel it, but it's not holding me down the way it was. That's the reality of the way humans are reacting to it. And that's my clinicians, not my thought. I mean, it's pretty obvious. I don't need to study a lab rat to figure that out. It's distraction. And there's nothing wrong with distracting someone who's preoccupied with pain so they get along in doing those things. You don't have to cure pain. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you, there's a card that we distributed. It's a little small index card. And I would just want to point out that in 2023, we're not knowing that cannabis cures anything, treats a whole lot of stuff, but curing, try to keep your thoughts of what it does and how it does what it does, not to glorify it and saying it cures cancer. It does not cure cancer. Not that cancer is one thing anyway, but people who advocate for it, who start speaking in those terms, summarily get dismissed by real researchers because they know otherwise. But the practical way I look at it is it distracts the afflicted person who's using it so they can distract themselves from the pain and get other things accomplished that are enriching to their lives. So I don't mind taking some, we got still some time left here. How would you like to continue? Anybody, is this helpful for everybody? Anybody, go ahead and talk, because we're just gabbing along here and trying to keep the flow going. But I think we pretty much said most of what I had planned to ask. And I'll tell you what, moderating these panels is fun for me because I get to ask the hard questions, throw a curveball once in a while. And I learn from this. I learn also from what you guys say. But if we're going to take questions, I'll cut you off if you're going to make a politically charged statement and use it as a bully pulpit. That's not what we're here for.
All right, Doc, how do we do this? I know you said we run the risk of being audited if we open it up to live questions. Do you want to moderate the question and say we can ask it? Or do you want me to walk around and give out some pads for people to write questions and have you read them?
I'll tell you, a quick little note will be really helpful. We'll vamp for a few moments, but if there's a specific question, my goal is to have this conference fully accredited. And I know what the triggers are in this particular space because it's a higher benchmark if you know ACCME accreditation than other subjects because it's controversial. And the ACCME makes certain guidelines for marijuana education that is different and gets greater scrutiny. I'm not here to serve as the heavy. I'm here to go ahead and see that meetings like this where we can have intelligent people responding to intelligent questions keeps it real and does not let it get politicized. I get pissed off, pardon my candor there, when the whole subject of cannabis and its politicalization gets in the way of its medicalization. It's not a moment in time with this meeting. It's a process. It's gone on for 50 years. It's getting to where it has to be medicalized, at least in Florida. I would hope federally we can deal with it to develop a consensus by intelligent questions coming back to further the conversation and ensure that what we're here for, which is knowledge, is ensured and shared. So pass around stuff, happy to review the questions. I think that's going to be the best way for us to continue to have accreditable conferences like this. So.
I don't really need to. They're mostly just my background.
I have a question.
Yes, sir. Oh, there's a hot mic.
So dramatic. I'll die.
So my question just tries to maybe take a step back from the recent discussion about pain and how do we include that in studies and how does that relate to physicians' experience with cannabis. One of the things that I understand, or at least stages of it, of course, there was the Epidiolex, which links the CBD suspension to the epilepsy. From my understanding, some of the better advanced studies also link some of the THC or CBD to other muscle spasms. So I'm just curious if that's an accurate sort of assessment of how far we've gotten with the science. And we've talked a lot of different ways about how the ensemble or the way that we provide the cannabis to a patient. Just curious if you can give me that sort of next stage in knowledge or gap that we're trying to address.
I can give you a straight answer from the 2017, January of 2017, federally commissioned meta-analysis from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So if you want to look at quality of data, that meta-analysis singled out things that either met substantial or conclusive evidence-based data through looking back at the volume of data that had been collected between that same entity's report in 1999, when it was called the Institute of Medicine. Same entity, though. That was another federally commissioned report, where that first report in 1999 is coming out only 3 years or so after California went medical, which is only 6 years, 1999, after the discovery of endocannabinoids mechanism of action. And that was the full mechanism of action. Receptors found in 88. But by 1992 and 3, you have anandamide and 2-AG, the two bodies' natural ligands that now fully define the mechanism of action on how this actually works. Until you know how the actual endogenous system really works, as I said a while ago, it's really hard to interpret evidence-based data. So what did the evidence-based data show that 2017 federally commissioned report reported? One, there's conclusive evidence-based data that it works for the nausea and vomiting. Specifically, the data up to that point was looking at cisplatin chemotherapy, but you had a wealth of knowledge that extended from there to wasting disorders, such as patients with HIV and AIDS wasting before they had the therapies that came later, when those patients, in order to still provide nutrients, were able to benefit from cannabis, so they kept eating, maybe live to see yet another day. So that's conclusive. But you had other things that had the benefits of substantial data. And those other two were what you alluded to, which were the muscle spasms that patients had with MS. Patients with multiple sclerosis, about 80 to 90%, all have periods of time in their illness where they have intolerably painful muscle spasms. That's what Sativex, which again was a GW Pharma project. Nabiximols, the generic name, if we're going to have to say ACCME guidelines, Sativex being the brand name. That showed substantial evidence-based data. Our country still has not come to terms with it through the FDA, but it's available in over 30 countries around the world today. That's another substantial evidence-based data. Another one that had substantial evidence-based data, and this is the sticky wicket, chronic pain. And I mentioned to you before the dilemmas with interpreting pain, but that was also what enjoyed substantial, not conclusive, but substantial evidence-based data. That's where that is probably right now, the one of those, I've just given you the third qualifier here. It's because of how little generally physicians know on either how to interpret or treat pain. Have to come a long way in that realm. The fourth is actually where the Epidiolex comes into play. Epidiolex is really pure CBD, and it's an elixir, but it's the same company out of GW Pharma. And that had conclusive evidence-based data for the kids with epilepsy and a few other unusual diseases that promoted infantile epilepsy, which was refractory to treatment. There's one other qualifying diagnosis now that adds to that, but for the most part, that was found to be not only conclusive, but because of the safety profile of this particular drug, Epidiolex, which didn't have THC, just CBD. In the last few years, in 2020, CBD was removed from controlled substances to put all the way to Schedule 5 in the following year, descheduled entirely. So there's a testament to its safety profile in contrast to THC. So now you have at least those 4 items that have either conclusive or substantial evidence-based data. As a clinician, you make a decision whether or not that should be good enough for your patient's benefit. Generally, those are the ones that I will hang my hat on now, not necessarily the other 6 qualifying conditions that Florida has or the other 35 that may be in a state off in the northwest part of our country, where those processes are ones that are being politically driven because more qualifying conditions means more patients to use the product. But as scientists, that's where the data evidence-based lies. So that sort of give you a difference.
I'll give one more comment, but then I want to curious to see what our questions are. But Epidiolex did really well in that trial of kids with seizures, but it makes the design of a new clinical trial complicated for me because the dose is really high. The dose of Epidiolex that were given to the kids with seizures, I honestly don't know what the equivalent is, but it would be the equivalent of 100 milligrams, hundreds of milligrams a day of CBD. When we send our patients or people go to the CBD store or go to the dispensary and say, how much should I take? They're usually not taking 100 milligrams a day. If you look at it, there are some published clinical trials for THC dependence where CBD was helpful in that case. And those were also several hundred milligrams a day. And several hundred milligrams a day of CBD is relatively expensive to a consumer who is going to buy it. And so if you were designing a study, and I have many of our trainees trying to do a clinical trial of CBD for anything from anxiety to pain to sleep, and we say, well, what dose should you use? 20 milligrams twice a day, 40 milligrams twice a day, 200 milligrams, 400 milligrams. That's also just a wide open research question that I feel we really, we know that a CBD product will stop this type of seizures in kids. And it was a great study. It did open the door to change the scheduling. And our team also, by the way, is giving some data to the FDA. It's due this summer, and the FDA is going to have a panel discussion later this year, I believe, to think about rescheduling it from Schedule 1. So they're collecting the data. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But
So you got to wear your doctor outfit.
I don't know if we really need high doses for true therapeutic effects versus not.
Well, remember when GW was doing that research, they were looking at purely as, I'll take that. They were doing that purely as a way to study Epidiolex as a pure CBD. The clinicians who found that patients were refractory, and yes, cost aside, and that is a real point, what they found is that if they added a whiff of THC to that, that was sometimes enough to bring the seizure threshold way down, and the therapeutics of it. So again, the balance in this case was largely CBD, but where I was going to before with one-to-ones and then branching off to one side or the other, this would be mostly CBD, but with a whiff of THC, whether in the genome, to say they're together, or in the clinical application of it. What you brought up is probably another confounder with only looking at cannabidiol as safe and effective as it is and expensive. The outliers were found to be better controlled with just a little bit of THC, but this is studies that have come subsequent to the release of that medicine. So let me just look at a few things here. Thank you.
I'll share an interesting fact while Dr. Block is reviewing the questions. So the markets and the production for CBD in Florida has moved from sort of a large scale expectation for the state to small acreage indoor lights in controlled environments. You might think of a medical marijuana grow operation in that way. which has been really interesting for me as an agronomist and a field ecologist. But as they're doing those sorts of studies to figure out what it'll take to saturate the market, so how many acres of cannabis production would be required to saturate the current needs of the country? An economic study like that comes out to something between 6,000 and 10,000 acres. They were 3,000
I mean, to
acres
be honest, I've never heard of any.
for the last year.
We have some questions here and I've distributed them to two of my colleagues. I've got one or two
All right,
things here.
Dr. Cook, any studies or thoughts on cannabis use to reduce alcohol abuse? Cannabis use for harm reduction, you could think about, I mean, we certainly hear anecdotes of people using it as substitutes for opioids, as a substitute for benzodiazepines, as a substitute possibly for methamphetamine, as a way to help reduce. And I look at the Florida Trees Reddit subforum, maybe some of you guys see it, and I'll see posts of people saying, thank God I'm 2 years sober. Thank you, cannabis. So certainly we see anecdotal stories of people who say they quit drinking and they attribute their success to cannabis, but there aren't any hard studies. And I actually had the opportunity to ask the director of the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse the question of whether he would support a clinical trial. And 3 years ago, he said he wouldn't. But I think we're closer to the point now where we really could do studies to see how cannabis can help people to reduce other substances, including alcohol.
I'll answer one before Dr. McCurdy, so I'll flip it back to you right after. Regarding memory loss, IQ, reduction IQ, how many hours? Memory loss is not associated with the IQ. It's not that necessarily somebody can't memorize, because IQ is something you're actually born with. You can do your IQ when you're 3 years old or 50 years old, and generally that's where you stay. So IQ is not normally something you'd expect to see changing through development. What I believe that the Dunedin study is doing is it's looking at the neural development that happens in the kids who started at 15 years old, where those processes and connections really are not getting towards their adult final version until probably in your mid-20s. So how do you tell kids when they're free and off on their own, like my kids will be as 18-year-olds, and they can go off to war and they can drink alcohol in a few short years too. Don't do this particular drug till you're 25. It's hard to implement and enforce. But again, who's ever asked me a question about IQ? IQ is generally something you're born with that you're expected to stay the same as you get older. It would be great if I could get my IQ to be better by taking a medicine or just studying more, but that's not the way it works. What you do with it though is over time. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I got a question here. What would you love to study about cannabis if it was federally legal? That's a great question because there's so many things that we really want to understand. And I think the first and foremost thing would be looking at this sort of one-to-one balance and then pushing in the opposite directions, right? So you're getting more and more THC or more and more CBD, and really starting to understand what that translates to in what we call exposure. So looking at blood level contents of those different chemicals, and then correlating that to some sort of outcome, whether that's pain treatment, sleep, muscle spasms, epilepsy, wherever we would want to go. I think what's interesting right now is we have a situation where all of the evidence that's been collected medically and backed is on the pure chemicals. And so we look at CBD combined with pure THC, or we look at CBD alone or THC alone, but we've never looked at the full plant material in its natural composition. And so this is the same thing we deal with kratom too, and looking at it as what I refer to these natural products as very complex symphony orchestras. And so you have lots and lots of instruments playing a beautiful tune when they're all together. And what we're doing when we take out each single chemical and purify it is we're listening to that contribution on full blast. And we can really attribute what that chemical relates to in terms of potential therapeutics. But we have to always keep that in mind that we've removed it from its natural environment and its natural sort of collection that nature has put it into. And chemotypes can vary. And so again, there could be chemotypes that push us to different treatment ways that are better for some symptoms than other symptoms. And I think these are all the things that there's so many questions to answer. I think these are all the things that I would love to study if cannabis was federally legal and we could go to a dispensary, take it into the lab, look at it, figure out exactly what the components are, not just based on a COA from whoever tested it as third party, but really getting into the nitty gritty of everything that's there, including the terpenes, and then going from there to see what's exposed in the blood supply and then what those outcomes would be. So that's a huge question with tons of answers.
Thanks. Can answer one and then turn it over to Zach about many difficulties. Well, researching the US. What do you know about research outside the US? A lot more fluid and a lot more important work has come out of countries other than our own over the last 50 years. Some that come right away to mind is Israel. That's where Dr. Meshulam's work was done. We've just talked about GW Pharma for manufacturing, which is England. I'll tell you that other research in Germany, for instance, which happens, and they have their formulations of cannabis as well. The Germans researched exactly what you would think, along with Dr. Freud, different psychiatry, psychotic things, schizophrenia, different uses versus who you're not wanting to use it on. That's research that largely comes out of there. The Italians, they've done valuable research. Vincenzo De Marzo for years has done work as an Italian researcher, but they're interested in different things as you would figure about, hey, if I eat too much, metabolic syndrome and skinny weed, THCV, that's some research comes from there. The Spanish have done a lot of work for brain tumors, neuroblastomas, where cannabis certainly has certain ways that at least it's revealed what cannabinoid receptors do in the brain to mitigate collateral damage injury from surgical interventions. So yes, more research has come from international than domestic over the years. Zach's got one question, and then just within the next 2 or 3 minutes, I've got two last ones. The first ones come from you and the doctor's handwriting, I'm sure, but I'll do the best I can. And you've got the first of three.
So this one is asking about the heavy metals. Is it a real issue for I think this one is pharmacotherapy, and how does that relate to the certificates as analysis and things like that? I think that is the critical point of third-party testing, is that for whatever product it is in the cannabis space, wherever it's come from, in terms of the raw material, having a lab test full panel that looks through the cannabinoids, looks through the metals, and perhaps probably most common looks through the pesticide chemicals, those contaminants of organic compounds. Those are probably the kind of acute concern, if you will, where the labels for pesticide, a whole bunch of pests and disease lysis plants, folks. Okay, and there are a lot of growers out there that are just kind of spraying what someone tells them to, so that they can get their product out the door. I'm also equally confident that there are very many reputable growers that'll address that. And so pesticides on raw fresh flower is probably a thing to be looking out for, as well as the metals.
Thank you. So in the last 2 minutes that remain, and by the way, we'll be around later. So if we didn't get to your question, although I think we're going to cover all of them, the one person who submitted 3 questions must be a doc, because the handwriting is a little tough, but you handled yours fine. The last 2 questions from that individual: what do you know about genetic testing for cannabis pharmacotherapy? Is anyone recommending it that way? I'll share with you that the Human Genome Project was completed around the year 2000, and the first plant genome was done in 2003. It wasn't cannabis, but there have been over 1,000 cannabis genomes done from different cultivars or chemovars. The interesting thing about both of those is that the same way I can have you put your saliva in an envelope and I can tell you where you really come from. You don't know it. I can do that with these hybrids that people don't really know, have them tested, and I can tell you where the genomics of the plant actually came from. Where am I going with that? Well, personalized medicine depends on a person from their genetic makeup and the things they're susceptible to, having medicines that are unique to their needs. And so I'm convinced, and I don't know anybody doing work in this yet, but I'd love to. It makes sense that if a plant developed in the Indian subcontinent versus Africa, Asia, wherever, that if those genetics were used by those people for perhaps 1,000 or more years, that the individual human's genetics, if they can trace themselves back to that part of the world, just might find better therapeutics from that particular plant than something else without the knowledge. So yes, genomics are very important to what I believe will be the therapeutics derived from the matching of plant and human genomes for therapeutics. The last question they mentioned in the last 30 seconds, anybody looking at AI for optimum? Fascinating subject, isn't it? Not that I know of, but I'm sure AI will approach this the way it will everything that we know and do. This is the future. This is the way of keeping involved with a moving landscape. And it's not simply how strong the plant is, but what the available technologies and the science tools we have to try to get to the ultimate answer the soonest. Translational medicine, translational research, for those of you that were trained when I was, who was never taught that word, is what's the fastest way to get a discovery from the lab bench to the bedside. That simple way to not only have it the fastest way to get there, but what checks and balances have to continuously happen along the way for not simply quality improvement, but continuous quality improvement is the secret of what we strive for. And so with that and zero time left, thanks. It's been great speaking with you, and we'll look forward to seeing you later.
Thank you, docs. If I could just make a couple of quick comments. We've got refreshments out in the hallway, not in the exhibit hall, because the exhibitors are still setting up. Reception tonight is at 5:30. Lastly, tomorrow in my announcements, I've got a way for you all to provide evaluation. So we've got an evaluation form that I'm going to send out to everybody. I need your feedback. I need to have you critique them just as well as they critique us. We need feedback from everybody in the room about the conference. So with that, enjoy the break, and we'll be back here at 3:30.